I'm going to take a few minutes to show you how to read this concept map. First off, it's done with a program called MindNode, which last time I checked was only available for Mac and iOS systems, but that may no longer be true. I think there's a free version of it, or at least there used to be, and then there's a pro version of it. The um, cheap version, I think, is $4. So anyway, you don't have to have it to read this, just in case you wanted to make your own or edit the one that I've made. I made this primarily for myself because it gives me sort of a visual representation of all of these complex relationships. Okay, so we will start here where we started the cardiovascular system, because of course the overriding function of the cardiovascular system is flow, to ensure adequate blood flow to capillary beds. And then the next thing that we did was we said that flow was augmented by pressure, especially the difference in pressure between 2 points, and flow was opposed by resistance. So when you see a green line, it means that this is a positive or direct relationship, and this is like an inverse relationship or a negative relationship. Not negative as in bad, negative as in down. Okay, so what we were doing last time in class was we were starting on this concept. One of the most important things to generate blood pressure is what your heart is doing. So we also talked about basically what's going on with blood pressure is heart volume, and then this is actually vessels, the resistance and the pressure related because of what's going on in the vessels. So where we were last time, we were talking about cardiac output, and cardiac output being the product of heart rate times stroke volume. Heart rate we'll get to in just a minute. Stroke volume we were doing last time. This tends to be the part where people have a little trouble. So explaining it again is not going to hurt anything. So if I unfold stroke volume, I can see that the primary determinants of stroke volume are the concept of afterload, and that doesn't say atrial, that says arterial pressure. That's the pressure that the heart is pushing against. Afterload tends to decrease stroke volume and therefore decrease cardiac output. And then where we were on Thursday was the concept of EDV, and the concept of EDV has a couple of things that add to it. So one of the things that we will see, oh, by the way, this concept map is slightly different than the one you have. I'm going to post this one because this was the most updated version. It's just a tiny little bit different. Okay, so the concept of EDV, which is end diastolic ventricular volume, basically says this is the volume in the ventricles immediately before contraction or systole, end diastolic ventricular volume. Okay, EDV, of course, directly correlates to stroke volume. Yeah, so higher EDV will make a higher stroke volume. And the relationship between EDV and the concept of preload. Preload is sort of the how full the ventricles are, because the ventricles are stretchy, so they can be fuller. One of the things that impacts preload is heart rate. A lower heart rate will give us longer filling time, which will give more preload. And the other thing that impacts preload is atrial pressure, which is both how full the atria are and how much they contract. Okay, so these directly correlate to EDV, heart rate, over there too. Okay, now this concept of Starlings Law is basically saying that there's this inherent relationship that sarcomeres in cardiac muscle contract better when they are fuller. And so let's look at that relationship. So this is Starling's Law. Scoot over. There it is. Okay. So basically, more venous return, more blood going back into the heart, will stretch the sarcomeres so that they actually have a better end diastolic ventricular volume. And venous return also impacts atrial pressure. But the primary components of venous return are the skeletal muscle pump, which is what your skeletal muscles are doing to your veins to help return blood, and then the respiratory pump, which is that um, your respiratory system, when your diaphragm contracts, it increases pressure in your abdominal pelvic cavity and a comparative decrease in pressure in your thoracic cavity, which aids in venous return, which stretches these, which aids to EDV. Okay, so all of this is related to end diastolic ventricular volume. So, and the one, a lot of you guys got this question wrong, by the way, on the quiz, so go back and look at it. There is another thing that is related to stroke volume that is independent of these two, so listen carefully to this. This is the concept of ventricular contractility. Here's the important thing, and I will cover it again on Tuesday. It is independent of volume, okay? So ventricular contractility is how hard the ventricles contract given a constant volume. And this has to do with the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system can cause the ventricles, the wall of the ventricle, to contract harder without actually using EDV. Okay, so there's a question that covers this. EDV is all related to volume. This is holding the volume in the ventricles constant and then stimulating them to contract harder. So look at that question carefully sometime before you have your test, and we'll cover it in lecture as well on Tuesday. Okay, now, so this is all related to stroke volume. We have afterload, that's in the arteries. This is what's in the ventricle, volume dependent. And this, we are going to see, is related to what the sympathetic nervous system does to the wall of the ventricle. Okay, and then we can look at heart rate. So if we go over here and look at heart rate and unfold this, we will see that basically heart rate is directly correlated to cardiac output. We know it also has this little relationship to filling time, but the primary determinant of heart rate is, of course, the rate of depolarization in the pacemaker cells, which, of course, can be decreased by parasympathetic innervation, increased by sympathetic innervation, also increased by adrenal medulla epinephrine, that's hormonally, so that's one way that you can have hormonal control of heart rate. Okay, so this is all nervous system control of heart rate because this is all part of the autonomic nervous system. And then hormonal control of heart rate. So the one hormone that you know right now that controls heart rate is epi, but there is another one, and it's thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone has a relatively minor but long-term impact on heart rate, meaning that if you have hyperthyroid, your heart rate tends to be faster. Hypothyroid, your heart rate tends to be slower. Okay, now we haven't covered this in class yet, but I'll do it here first. How does the autonomic nervous system decide whether to stimulate the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system? It basically is using fight or flight. We already know that, but then some other things that I haven't taught you guys yet. So one of them is chemoreceptors. So what is going on is we are constantly monitoring the content of arterial blood in the aortic arch and carotid sinus. And if it looks like the arterial blood has too much carbon dioxide, or it's low pH, or it's low oxygen, then you will stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. The opposite would make you stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. And then the baroreceptor reflexes. I monitor the pressure in the carotid sinus and the aortic arch again to decide if the pressure is too high. If it's too high, I will stimulate the parasympathetic. If it's too low, I will stimulate the sympathetic. And then I also monitor the pressure in the right atrium and the superior and inferior vena cava. But this is arterial and this is venous, and we'll come back to that. Okay, and then the only other thing to cover is sort of what's going on with the vessels, which we kind of already touched on. So what can the vessels do to blood flow? Well, resistance can be impacted by vessel length, the viscosity of the blood, and vessel diameter. The sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system also impact vessel diameter. We didn't talk about this one much. I'll touch on it on Tuesday. And then the last thing is, what do the kidneys have to do with all of this? What they can do is change blood volume and therefore change blood pressure. And they do this a couple of different ways, primarily hormonally. So these are all hormones that we have learned before. Actually, I don't think I taught you this one. But, okay. So this is just the first time you hear it, so don't get stressed out if you don't understand it. ADH would make the kidneys retain water, increase blood volume, therefore increase blood pressure. Aldosterone would do the same through this mechanism, which is called the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. And that will make you retain sodium, therefore retain water, increase your blood pressure. Renin-angiotensin also will cause vasoconstriction. And then EPO, which is erythropoietin, that causes you to increase blood volume by increasing red blood cell synthesis. And then last but not least, ANP or ANF. This one actually causes the kidneys to lose water, and that will decrease your blood volume and decrease your blood pressure. Okay, so I'm going to post this video, and then I will post a PDF of this as well.